Hey guys, it's Pton here. Today I'll be doing a deck profile for Ling's Oracle Think Tank Magus deck. So let's get started. Alright, so Magus is a returning archetype for Oracle Think Tank in standard. And they are currently Misaki's main deck as well. So basically the Magus series of cards, Magus archetype of cards, in standard they focus on drive checks, so getting triggers. They get additional power off trigger checks, and they have cards like the VR, which increases the number of drive checks you can do in one turn. So without further ado, let's get into the deck list. Alright, we'll start with the grade 3s first. So 4 copies of the main VR for Magus, Pentagonal Magus. 2 effects. So the first effect is continuous. On Vanguard Circle, the power increase of trigger effects revealed for a drive check gets 5,000 power. Plus 5,000 power. So instead of plus 10k for a trigger effects, they get plus 15k instead. So it makes guarding a whole lot harder for your opponent. Second effect is when it attacks, it can soul blast 1 grade 3 and discard 5 cards from your hand. And Pentagonal Magus gets plus 3 drive. But the number of cards discarded from a hand for this cost is reduced by 1 for each rearguard you have in your front row with Magus in its card name. So what does that mean? So let's say you have Pentagonal Magus on the Vanguard Circle, and you have 2 Magus rearguards in your front row as well. So instead of discarding 5 cards to get a plus 5, to get a Penta drive, but obviously to get a plus 3 drive checks, you only have to discard 3 cards since you have 2 front row Magus rearguards. So that's why Ling's deck is almost, I would say it's a pretty much full Magus deck, just so Ling can afford to just discard 3 cards to get the full effect off, which is pretty good. So as I've mentioned, Magus, they focus a lot on drive checking and getting trigger units and getting trigger effects off their drive checks as well. So Pentagonal Magus really helps in that aspect, in increasing the number of drive checks and also increasing the power of these trigger effects. So in my opinion, Pentagonal Magus is those kind of cards in which you either have a perfect guard to stop it, or you just gonna take the damage. Because in before, when we have twin drive, you can just say like, I'm gonna guard 2 pass. But with Pentagonal Magus and with her power up effect, it's very hard to guard. And because it's gonna be a 5 drive, and your opponents are probably not going to be able to guard for 5 pass, which is insane. So in my opinion, it's really just your opponent either has a perfect guard or they're just gonna take their damage. Yep. The backup grade 3 is Hexagonal Magus. So this card came in the Misaki Tokura trial deck. So 2 effects. When placed on Vanguard Circle, counterblast 1, look at 2 cards from the top of the deck, put them on the top of the deck in any order, and draw a card. So on right, plus 1 to hand, and you get to mess around with your deck position as well. Second effect, when a drive check reveals a trigger unit, this unit gets 5,000 power until end of turn. So it's a slightly tamer version of Pentagonal Magus, but works in about the same way. So how it works is, let's say you drive check a trigger. For Pentagonal Magus, that trigger power gets plus 5,000, so it will become a plus 15k. But for Hexagonal Magus, what it does is that she herself gets 5k regardless of whether you give the trigger effect to her or not. So that's the difference between Pentagonal Magus and Hexagonal Magus, but both work very well as well. Both are pretty decent effects. So, and the thing about Hexagonal Magus is that she works on rearguard, so she's actually the grade 3 in the deck that you actually that you can actually consider calling to rearguard, just because she can be a pretty big beater. Especially with Pentagonal Magus' 5 drive checks, the chances of you pulling a trigger is pretty likely. And so let's say you pull like 2 triggers or 3 triggers, so let's say 2 triggers, Hexagonal Magus' skill stacks, so she'll get plus 10,000 regardless of whether you give the trigger effect to her or not. So yep, very solid backup grade 3 for the deck in my opinion. And her first skill that allows you to draw also allows you to build up a hand size for next turn, to especially since you have to discard for Pentagonal Magus, and also to try to draw into a Pentagonal Magus if you haven't already drawn into them. So yep, only 8 grade 3s because as I've mentioned, this deck is going to be a full Magus focused deck, and Magus only currently has 2 types of grade 3s. So of course we have more grade 3s that are coming up, such as like Fusili Magus in the upcoming Aerial Steed Liberation, which is a very exciting set. So definitely looking forward to that, because Magus are getting quite a bit more quality support in that set as well. Let's move on to the grade 2s. 4 copies of Rectangle Magus. Pretty much staple for the Magus deck, just because she has the Magus name and because she's also pretty much staple in almost every Oracle Think Tank deck. So 2 effects. When placed on Rearguard Circle, Counter Blast 1 and Soul Blast 1. Look at 2 cards from the top of the deck. Arrange them in any order and can draw a card. So similar to Hexagonal Magus, except that it costs additional 1 Soul Blast and it only works on Rearguard. Second effect is when your drive check reveals a trigger unit, this unit gets 5,000 power. So essentially it's like a grade 2 version of Hexagonal Magus. I'm not going to explain too much, just a solid card overall. Allows you to have a pretty decent grade 2 game, and it's just a pretty scary card overall on the Pentagonal Magus turn. Next grade 2 is 4 copies of Rhombus Magus. Yep, all these Maguses are based off shapes, which actually makes them really unique. So Rhombus Magus, what does she do? When it attacks on Rearguard Circle, if your Vanguard is a Magus, until end of that battle, Rhombus Magus gets 5,000 power, and if your Vanguard is grade 3, your opponent cannot intercept. So it blocks off an intercept for her attack, and she's a 14k beta, which I think is pretty decent. Again, Magus currently does not have that many amazing grade 2 support cards. Of course, that's all going to change with Aerial Steed Liberation, but this is all that we have available, so of course Ling is playing her, and I think it's pretty good as well. Blocking off the intercepts potential from your opponent can maybe hinder some plays from your opponent and reduce the total number of shield value that your opponent has to guard against Magus. And the thing about Magus is that they hit really high numbers, so every tiny bit of shield that your opponent has is very crucial in ensuring that they can guard your turn, especially your Pentagonal Magus' turn. So, yep, just 4 copies of Rhombus Magus, pretty decent card. And then the last grade 2 I play, or rather Ling plays, is Stellar Magus. So a rare card. 2 effects. On Rearguard Circle continuous. During the battle it is boosted. This unit gets plus 2,000 power. So it's an 11k on boost. So let's say you boost it with a grade 1 8k, hitting for 19. Rather awkward number, but can still allows you to hit force Vanguards and stuff like that. Second effect is when this attack hits a Vanguard, you may put a card from a hand on the top of the deck. So this is a very fun skill to have in Magus. So one way you can use that effect is have Stellar Magus as your last attack and hope that your opponent takes it. If your opponent does take it, you can actually put triggers, like draw triggers or heal triggers on the top of the deck to prepare for your opponent's attacks next turn, or rather prepare for your damage checks next turn. So you can just put a draw trigger on the top of a deck, and next turn damage check into the draw trigger and draw 1 card off it, as well as get the plus 10k. Or you can put a heal trigger if you know you're probably going to lose next turn, and save yourself. Yep. If not, you can also have her as the first attack of the turn and stack a trigger on top so that Pentagonal Magus drive checks into at least 1 trigger, which actually sets off her first effect to increase the power increase of trigger units, as well as sets off Hexagonal Magus and Rectangle Magus' effect. So it's a very, I would say it's a very situational and pretty gimmicky card that isn't very consistent, but can be pretty interesting if her effect does work out. But really, she's in this deck just for the Magus name. Yeah, just so Ling doesn't have to discard too many cards for Pentagonal Magus. But still okay card overall. Yep. So those are the grade 2s. As I've said, better grade 2s are coming our way, so the grade 2 lineup is very likely going to be revamped after the new set. For grade 1s, 4 of the probably the best grade 1 in the deck, Tetra Magus. So, two effects, one effect, which is when placed on rearguard, if your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you can counterblast 1, draw a card, reveal up to 1 critical trigger from your hand, and put it on the top of your deck. So essentially, gives you a +1 to hand to build up a hand size for a discard cost for Pentagonal Magus. And it also allows you to stack a critical trigger on the top of a deck. So you can do this on your Pentagonal Magus' turn, so that it makes guarding a whole lot harder for your opponent, and also allows you to activate Rectangle Magus, Pentagonal Magus, and Hexagonal Magus' skill. So Tetra Magus, solid card overall, nothing much to comment on. The next rare one that Ling plays is 2 copies of Circle Magus. When rolled upon, counterblast 1 and draw a card. So she's the main grade 1 right target, allowing you a +1 to hand. Second effect is on Vanguard and Rearguards. When your drive check reveals a grade 2 or greater card, you may put that card on the bottom of a deck. If you do, draw a card. So you can see that this is really good in allowing you to build a good hand, ensuring you get all your pieces, and also probably to increase the shield value in your hand. But I will say that it's also a very good card on the Pentagonal Magus turn, in ensuring that you don't drive check too many grade 2s and 3s, which will probably reduce the total shield value in hand. Or rather, that allows you to filter through your drive checks and make your drive checks have higher shield value, so that to allow you to guard better next turn. 3 QR Magus. So QR Magus comes on a trial deck. On Vanguard Rearguard, when placed, look at the top 2 cards of a deck, arrange them in any order. Very simple, allows you to ensure that you check your triggers correctly at the right timing, and also for example your draw triggers, and just a good card overall for the deck. And all of them, as you can see, have the Magus name, so really helps in the Pentagonal Magus, in reducing Pentagonal Magus' cost as well. 3 copies of Ripis Magus. Now Ripis Magus is a really nice card for Magus. So have a look at the skill, which is when it boosts, if your Vanguard is Magus, this unit gets 5,000 power. So you can just put 3 Ripis Magus on your back row, and you have 13k boosters, which is solid. Right, 13k boosting a grade 2 9k will be 22k, which is magic against the majority of Vanguards as well. So yep, 3 Ripis Magus, and then lastly 2 Crescent Magus. Alright, so Crescent Magus is a tech choice by Ling, because she finds that sometimes things get a bit counterblast heavy in the deck, especially if you want to be spamming Tetra Maguses, Rectangle Maguses, and Hexagonal Maguses. And the thing about this deck is that you really want to minimize the number of non-Magus cards you play in this deck. So Ling doesn't really want to play Oracle Guardian Gemini, and she instead chooses to play Crescent Magus for that counter charge. So when placed in a trigger zone, if your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, Soul Blast 1 and counter charge. Simple skill and not that difficult to set off, honestly, because with the additional drive checks from Pentagonal Magus, you increase your likelihood of checking into her, as well as checking the triggers, of course. So yeah, she does come off like maybe once per game, so not that bad. And she's also 8k boost and has the Magus card name, and has the Magus in her name. So that rounds up the normal units. We'll move on to the trigger units, then I will talk about some of the alternative cards you can play. Not a lot of alternative cards actually for this deck if you really want to go for full Magus, because we do not have a lot of Magus as of now. But I'll probably share with you guys some of my thoughts on the new Magus cards that have been revealed in Aerial Steed Liberation. But for the triggers, very simple: 8 crits, 4 draws, 4 heals, the standard trigger lineup. 8 crits, just so you can overkill your opponent with Pentagonal Magus. Just 4 PG draws, because they're Sentinels, and it's good to build up your hand size for the discard cost for Pentagonal Magus. You don't want to have like 2 little cards in your hand that you cannot discard anything. Oh yeah, and the thing about Pentagonal Magus is that you can discard Protect Sentinels as well, your Protect Gift markers. So on right you get 1 Protect Gift marker, so you don't lose too many cards from your hand as well. So we still need the draw trigger in this deck. 8 crits, as I've mentioned, and I've explained, and 4 heals, because heals can save you. So very standard trigger lineup, nothing much to explain here. So yep, that's all for the deck. This is one card that you can consider. Brilliant Magus. So her skill is counterblast 1 and rest 2 rear guards in the same column as this unit. Draw a card and one of your vanguards gets plus 10,000 power. So it makes your vanguard's attack even harder to guard and probably only stoppable by a perfect guard. So it's a very interesting card, but the lack of stand triggers in standard makes this card not really worth playing as compared to the other grade 2s. So yeah, but if you want, you can always have like 1 or 2 copies of her in the deck, although it can reduce your offensive ability. Alright, before I get into the alternatives, let me just share some thoughts about the deck. So I would say the deck is definitely one that you want to be, be a bit more rushy and more aggressive, because for Pentagon Magus, you don't want to drag the game out for too long, since the additional drive checks can make you deck out in a way. So just imagine if you use her effect once every turn, every consecutive turn, you're gonna lose like a lot of cards from your deck from drive checks, and we're not counting draw triggers as well and draw effects like Tetra Magus or Circle Magus and Rectangle Magus as well. So you really want to be more aggressive and just rush your opponent down, make it such that they can't guard your gigantic attacks. And this deck has the potential to hit very, very high numbers, depending on your drive checks and depending on the rear guards you have, like whether you have Rectangle Magus or Hexagonal Maguses on the field. Yeah, so Divya herself is the finisher for the deck. And if you were to do a comparison with Ling's other deck, which is the Imperial Daughter deck, here, let me just get it out. If you compare the deck to Ling's other deck, which is the Imperial Daughter build, I would say that the Imperial Daughter deck may be a slightly more consistent deck, and a deck that's able to play into the late game as compared to Pentagonal Magus. And Imperial Daughters and the Imperial Daughter deck is able to hit like magic numbers more consistently, even though the Pentagonal Magus deck is able to hit higher numbers more easily because of the additional 3 drive checks, allowing you to hit more triggers. So both decks have their own merits, both decks have their strengths, both decks play slightly differently from each other and have their own unique play styles. So it's very good. There's variety within Oracle Think Tank, in my opinion. So still a very nice deck. And with the new support from Aerial Steed Liberation, the Magus deck actually got a whole lot better with cards that increase your drive check further by 1, making your Vanguard even harder to guard. So clans that don't have easy access to perfect guards may actually lose out pretty badly to Pentagon Magus, whereas clans that can get easy access to perfect guards, like for example Magasu Storm for Nubatama is a built-in perfect guard himself, so maybe that will have a better matchup against Magus, but as well as Angel Feather. But clans that don't have easy access to perfect guards, or those decks who have like small hand size and don't draw that much, may find it hard to guard the gigantic attacks from Magus. So that's just my opinion with the Magus deck. So let me just share with you guys on some of the upgrades I will do for the deck with the upcoming Aerial Steed Liberation. First card I want to talk about is Fusilli Magus. So Fusilli Magus' skill is activated on rearguard circle, counterblast 1 and soul blast 1. One of the vanguards with Magus in his card name gets plus 10,000 power as well as plus 1 drive until the end of turn. So you can activate multiple copies of this card in 1 turn, right? Which will be a bit overkill, but Fusilli Magus is really good in making your vanguard hits huge numbers, and that plus 1 drive can be very helpful as well in ensuring you get more triggers. And as I've mentioned, the Magus deck gets stronger the more trigger effects or rather the more triggers you reveal during your trigger checks or your drive checks. So yeah, Fusilier Magus is probably going to be added into the deck, making the deck have like maybe 10 grade 3s. I would say maybe Fusilier Magus will be in the deck for like 3 copies, add 3 copies and 3 copies of hexagonal and 4 pentagonal, making 10 grade 3s, so that you know you will have enough grade 3s in the soul for you have enough grade 3s to write into and enough grade 3s in the soul for Pentagonal Magus' effect to go off. So Fusilier Magus is definitely a very nice card for Magus overall. And then the other cards that we have that are worth mentioning will be the Ravioli Magus as well as the Pton Magus. So cards that are named after like spaghetti. So both cards have the effect when a judge reveals a trigger unit, this unit gets power plus something. So for the grade 2, gets plus 10k, but it's once per turn only. Whereas for the grade 1, it actually stacks, right? It gets 5k only, but it stacks, which means that if you drive check like 3 triggers, he's gonna get 15k, which actually makes it such that you can actually replace your Rippers Magus with that new card. Because the chances of you pulling a trigger with your additional drive checks is very high. It's pretty high, right? So Ling usually pulls like 2 to 3 triggers every time she uses Pentagonal Magus' skill. So Pen Magus is actually a really nice addition, can be a very nice addition to the deck. And Ravioli Magus makes it such that you have better beaters in the deck. So I would say that replace Stellar Magus with Ravioli Magus. Or maybe even Rhombus Magus if you want to. But definitely take out Stellar Magus first for that, because just so you can hit slightly higher numbers. And the thing about Ravioli Magus is that she hits 19k with just 1 trigger boost. So with Ravioli Magus and Pen Magus, the deck can hit much higher numbers, and it really feels more like force, like giant columns, which is very good. It adds on to the offensive pressure of the deck. Other cards worth mentioning, I would say, is probably White Hair of Inaba. So what does White Hair of Inaba do? White Hair of Inaba's skill is, at the end of the battle, it boosted a grade 3 Vanguard. You can put a card from your hand into your soul and draw a card. So it allows you to fill up your soul with grade 3s without needing to rewrite, so that you can use Hexagonal Magus' as well as Fusilier Magus skills on Rega Circle, all while still having enough grade 3s in your soul to activate Pentagonal Magus' effect. So White Hair of Inaba may be a pretty interesting card to play in the deck as well. So I think that's about it for the deck. So I hope you guys enjoyed the deck profile and me sharing about Magus. So personally, I don't play Magus, I don't play Oracle Think Tank, but these are just some of the thoughts that I had while looking through the Oracle Think Tank Magus cards, as well as watching Ling as well as Max play this deck. So I hope you guys found the video informative and interesting. More videos will be coming up soon, and before I end the video, just like to show off Ling's gift markers as well as the starter, which I forgot to show off. So we have 2 artworks for Launch Magus. This is what Ling is playing for Magus, and her gifts, which I think I've already shown off in the other Oracle Think Tank deck profile, her Imperial Daughter deck profile that I did some time ago. So thank you guys for watching. That was Ling's Pentagonal Magus deck. Bye guys.